So maybe you just got yourself a brand new Mustang, or maybe you picked up an old one like this 1966 Fender Mustang that I just finished restoring, and you're super excited to get it home and it finally arrives, or you picked it up at your local guitar store and lo and behold, it plays like absolute shit. Now, because of that less than stellar experience, you might be tempted to just return it if you can, or maybe put your guitar up on the market and just cut your losses. But stay tuned, because we are going to be going over all of the things that you need to do to make your Mustang play the best that it possibly can. So like I just mentioned, I am making this video on the heels of restoring this 1966 vintage Fender Mustang. It came to me with a couple of the parts replaced, but more importantly, it came to me playing like a hot pile of garbage. It just did not play right. It would not stay in tune. And these are common complaints that folks have with the Fender Mustang. Now, the first reason why your Mustang plays like crap is because your bridge is too low. The Mustang that I'm holding here, when it first arrived to me, had this bridge basically slammed all the way down against the base plate of the Vibrato. It could still rock back and forth, but it just really did not feel good. The bridge itself would not return to center. Basically, what you want here, for me at least, is a minimum of 2 millimeters between the bottom of the bridge base and the top of the vibrato base plate. You want that for a couple of reasons. Number one, you want there to be enough break angle behind the bridge so that you have an appropriate amount of string tension on your Mustang. And that string tension is going to allow the bridge to operate in the way that it was intended, which is to rock back and forth, and then theoretically speaking, or if set up well, it should most of the time return back to perfect center, right? When your bridge is slammed down against the vibrato plate, it does not allow for that kind of movement. It can tend to get stuck after it shifts forward towards the pickups or backwards towards the cigar bar. And so you want to make sure that you have got enough height on that bridge. And that leads me to the second point of why your Mustang might play like crap. And that is because you do not have the appropriate angle at the neck, right, for you to be able to actually raise that bridge and still have comfortable or low action. Now, when I first received this Mustang, it came to me without a shim in the neck pocket, despite the fact that I could clearly see from the original paint that there used to be one in there. There is a multitude of reasons, mostly myths, of why people end up taking out the factory installed shims in these guitars, but most of them are honestly unfounded, and the guitars end up playing worse as a result of it. So the very first thing that I did when I got this, after raising that bridge up to about 2 millimeters, was to install an inner pocket neck shim, right? And this one here was made by Curtis Novak. I usually just end up using pieces of cardstock for my shims. These are made from, just cut from the edge of one of these Fender cardstock labels here, and these make perfect shims, and they come out to about 0.75 millimeters, both Curtis Novak's as well as, you know, the homemade shim, and that gave me enough pitch back on the neck to be able to raise my bridge to about 2 millimeters and still have very nice, comfortable, and low action. One thing to check before you go installing shims on your neck is do a little bit of research on the Googles, if you will, or on your favorite offset guitar centric forum, and double check to see if your particular model already has an angled neck pocket, because if you've got, for example, a 1 degree angled neck pocket, you should not have to add even more shim unless it is something that you are trying to dial into taste. Now, the next reason why your Mustang is not playing the way that it should be is because your strings are either too light or too heavy. And this one here came to me with 9 to 42 gauge strings, which, while they were a pleasure to play and made me feel like I was superhuman and could very easily bend on this short scale guitar without any effort whatsoever, they were just unfortunately too light. And I'm saying this from a place where I am assuming that you want to use your vibrato and have it actually work well, and keep tune after using it, and have a stable experience overall with your guitar. Now, when your strings are too light, you will notice that you won't have enough tension on your vibrato, and therefore the cigar here is going to end up leaning backwards a bit far, right? When ideally you want it to be as close to perpendicular with the top of the body as possible. As you can see here, it's not perfectly perpendicular, but it is a hell of a whole lot closer than it was when it first arrived to me. Now, the reverse of that, when you've got strings that are too heavy, you will end up having your cigar leaning forward, and both of those things are very bad for tuning stability. Now, this principle works in conjunction with the fourth point that I'm going to make here, which is that the springs in your vibrato unit do not have enough tension, or the reverse, have too much tension. In the case of this 1966 Mustang that came with those 9 gauge strings, we had too little tension from these strings to be able to pull that cigar bar forward enough so that it was closer to perpendicular to the top of the body. As a result of that, every time I would use the vibrato, whether I was pushing down or pulling up, the guitar would end up going out of tune, right? Sometimes it could come back into tune if I played it just a little bit more, but obviously that is not the type of experience you want to have, especially if you are a live performer or you are recording in the studio and are on the clock. Those are not ideal scenarios to have to operate under. Now, my recommendation as far as the perfect combination of strings to spring tension that you can get is with 11 gauge strings. 11s on a 24-inch scale Mustang feel a lot like having 10s installed. At minimum, I would go with 10s, but any lighter than that and you are going to have issues. Additionally, to adjust the spring tension on your Mustang, you are going to have to remove the vibrato, and you will notice that there are 2 springs underneath that are connected to the posts that hold up the cigar bar. Now, depending on the era of your Fender Mustang or Squier Mustang, you're either going to have on the bottom of those posts 2 notches or 3 notches, and those control the amount of tension that these springs in your vibrato have. The further away these springs are from the bottom of the base plate of that vibrato, the higher the spring tension. And the reverse holds true. The closer you move the spring to the bottom of the vibrato plate, the more you are decreasing that spring tension. Now, there are folks who say that it's best to always have the spring set to the highest tension, or fixed to the bottommost notch on those posts. But obviously, there are a lot of factors that play into whether that holds true, such as how worn are those springs. For example, the ones on this Mustang here being, almost 60 years old or whatever, they are pretty worn. They feel really fluid and really smooth, but a lot of the ones that you'll find on your Squiers or your Japanese or Mexican ones can have quite stiff springs. So you are going to have to play to see, in conjunction with your string gauge, to see what brings you closest to perpendicular again on that cigar. Once you have everything set up. Now, on that note, I wanted to bring up point number 5, which is that your cigar or your hot dog is sitting a little bit too high. And this kind of touches on some of the things that we discussed before, but you want an appropriate break angle behind the bridge. And if your cigar is sitting a bit too high, then that break angle behind the bridge is going to be a little bit too shallow. Now, it's kind of a balancing act that you have to play with regards to the setup of that cigar and how high it should be, because you want to, generally speaking, set it pretty low, but also not so low that the strings are rubbing up against the back of the bridge channel here, or the bridge base, I should say, nor do you want these strings to be rubbing up against the screw heads. Additionally, if your cigar is set too low, you will find that you no longer have the ability to actually pull the vibrato upwards. And some folks think that the most stable way to set up a Mustang is to have that thing be as low as possible and only have the ability to push the vibrato down. And then if they let go, then everything returns back to pitch, supposedly. But for me, I like to have both the ability to push down as well as pull up on the vibrato, so I can do those glide strumming techniques that we all love on these offset guitars. And so, yeah, that is definitely one thing that you want to consider when setting up the vibrato on your Mustang. Now, that leads me to point number 6, because all of the stuff that we've been discussing over the past couple points is setting your vibrato up so it is, close to perpendicular and hopefully returns to that point after pulling up or pushing down and using it while you're playing. And that is to make sure that your vibrato arm is not actually touching the base plate for the vibrato. The reason why you do not want that to happen is because it can potentially prevent that cigar from coming back to center. So the way that you want to have it set up is so that it's as deep as it can go without protruding out of the bottom of the cigar. And then I tighten the taste. It's good to use the appropriate size screw, which I believe for import models is an M5 size little set screw. And for vintage ones, it's a 10-32 thread screw. And it's a fantastic idea to find the type of set screws that do have a nylon tip, because that leads me to the next point, which is your Mustang plays like crap because that little set screw is grinding up against your vibrato arm. Now, these things stock with those set screws basically have kind of a domed little set screw, but it's still metal on metal. And a lot of the vintage arms, or even the 90s and 2000s made in Japan vibrato arms, you're going to see that that little screw has like grinded away at the bottom of those vibrato arms, and it can sound awful. It can sound creaky and just metallic noises that you don't want to hear while you are playing. And so if you can find yourself a nylon tipped set screw that helps solve that issue and gives you the ability to easily move your arm, but also have it stay where you leave it. Now, the next thing that you are going to want to check to help avoid a bunch of these issues from tuning instability to the vibrato getting stuck and not coming back to center, is to make sure that your Mustang is properly lubricated. And for the way that I set these up and for the way most Mustang aficionados set that up, the lubrication is important in two different places. The first place that you want to make sure is properly clean and lubricated is the place where the cigar posts pivot against the sort of knife edge of the vibrato base plate. Now, over time, that area can get incredibly dirty. So if you end up picking up a vintage one or one of the Japanese ones from the 90s or the 2000s, or even just a more recent one from the past 10 years that's just been well loved and played out a lot, if your cigar bar is not coming back to center and your guitar coming back in tune after using that vibrato, that is one of the things that you are going to want to check. You're going to want to unscrew the posts from the cigar once you've uninstalled the vibrato. You're going to want to clean that area out, and then you're going to want to use a lubricant such as Tri-Flow or even 2-in-1 oil or lithium grease. All of those things can work well, and you just want to make sure that you are helping with that lubrication to facilitate as much ease as you can with that cigar and those springs, helping everything move back and forth smoothly. Now, the second place that you're going to want to check that is lubricated properly, and that doesn't just go for the Mustang, but pretty much all offsets that have vibratos on them, is the nut, right? Because if you do not have a properly lubricated nut, your strings can end up, getting bound up at the nut, even if the slots are the appropriate width and depth. And just using something like Big Ben's Nut Sauce or Music Nomad's Tune It, or even just using, some unflavored chapstick or Burt's Beeswax, like lip balm, is enough to help you lubricate and again facilitates you staying in tune much more successfully. Now, I literally just mentioned it, but if you've done all of the above so far and still you seem to be going out of tune, you're gonna want to check to make sure that your nut slots are actually the correct width and depth. Because if they are too narrow, and let's say that you stepped up 2 gauges from what came stock on your guitars, and I don't know why, but for some reason these guitars still ship sometimes with 9-gauge strings, which is, in my opinion, the worst gauge that you can be using on these guitars, especially if you want the vibrato to work properly. And so if you step up to 11s and you are still going out of tune after having done everything, definitely check those out. If you do not own, nut slotting files, I would bring your guitar to a reputable tech. Now, on that note, this is another thing that is a more general thing, but maybe you're not stringing properly, right? You do not want to have an excess amount of string, especially when you are setting up offset guitars that have a vibrato and a finicky system, like a rocking bridge like this. The way that I typically will string up these guitars, especially the ones that come with these like vintage style tuners, is I will pull the string taut and then cut 2 posts away from the post that I'm going to be installing on. That's what I do for the E, A, and D strings. Once I get to the G string, I will pinch that string after pulling it taut at the G post and then pull it back to the low E post, and then cut that string then at the high E post. And you can do that same thing for the B and the high E strings as well, that same approach that I just mentioned about the G, or you most of the time don't have to cut the B or high E strings at all. Now, if you weren't already doing that, and you just learned how to string up your Fender vintage style guitar properly, the next thing that you are going to not want to skip is stretching your strings. And I have found that on a Mustang, especially, it's good to stretch them two ways. The first stage that I will do in stretching the strings on a Mustang is to basically put them on, tune up to pitch, and then I will literally pull the string lightly, just enough so that my fingers can get underneath, right? And then tune back up to pitch. The way that I typically do it will be to do all of the strings, right? Pulling on all of the strings and then retuning the whole guitar, pulling on all the strings again. And with each consecutive time, you should be getting closer and closer to not going out of tune. And you're going to want to keep repeating that process until the guitar just doesn't go out of tune anymore. And the second thing that I do on a Mustang specifically is stretching the strings using the vibrato after doing what I just mentioned. Now, rather than pulling on the strings in this stage, I am tuning the guitar up to pitch and then playing the vibrato as I normally would. Right? I don't do any extreme dive bombs or trying to pull the vibrato all the way back for this stage. I just wanted to go through the range of motion that I typically apply when using the vibrato, and will keep doing so on each string now individually until I see that that string is always coming back in tune. And I have found after you do that, right, and all of the other things that I mentioned before, then the vibrato system is then perfectly set on your Mustang, and I find that it comes back in tune just as well as a well set up Jaguar or Jazzmaster, considering that all of those other steps were followed. So I'm going to go ahead and put my money where my mouth is and tune this bad boy up using just this little Polytune clip-on here. Okay. And it's mostly in tune. So I'm going to go ahead and play the vibrato the way that I normally would. And sometimes it actually takes a little bit of time for the vibrato to come back to center, right? But you saw just now that all of the strings are in tune still after using the vibrato. So yeah, if you follow those steps, I'm not just saying this to F around with you all. I'm not full of shite, if you will. You know, it will help you have a usable vibrato system on your Mustang. Now, another thing that is Mustang specific here is, in case you didn't know, Fender Mustangs, vintage ones, and even some of the newer reissues have some of the weakest wound pickups, and that is by design. That is the way that they were originally intended to be. And so as a result of it, you might find that out of the box that the guitar just sounds super duper weak. And the way that you have to address that, especially because these pickups have flat pole pieces, they are literally flush with the top of the bobbin. That is what's underneath these pickup covers, and you need to try to raise those up fairly high, fairly close against the strings. And here, if I were to measure for you, and again, it's going to be kind of different for everybody because the output of your pickups may be different from mine. These ones in this Mustang are just shy of 6K in output. I think it's like they're both about 5.7 5.8K a piece. But I've got this here, and I'm seeing that on the bass side, on the bridge pickup, I've got basically about maybe a little less than 2 millimeters between the top of the pickup and the bottom of the string. And same thing for the treble side on the bridge pickup. And I typically try to match that once I depress, the end of the neck here, all of the strings. I typically want, that like 2 millimeters or so between the top of the neck pickup and the bottom of the low and high E strings, right? But without depressing, I'm getting roughly about a little less than 4 millimeters on both sides of the neck pickup here. So yeah, you definitely want as strong of a signal coming out as possible from these weak pickups to get the best sound from your Mustang. Another thing that I've heard folks gripe about is noise coming from the Mustang. And yes, these are single coil pickups, but that's not the kind of noise I'm talking about here. I'm not talking about 60 cycle hum. I'm talking about grounding noise, right? And unlike Jazz Masters and even Jaguars, these old Mustangs did not come with like pick guard shields underneath. Some of the newer reissues may have like aluminum adhesive shielding on the back of those guards, but you want to make sure that everything to your circuit is ground properly. And an easy way to check, right, is number one, you want to make sure that you have a multimeter. It doesn't need to be an expensive one, just one that where you can set it to a mode that tests for continuity. Usually when you are touching two different parts of your circuit, you can see that there is continuity between them because your multimeter will beep, and you can easily check to see if you have continuity on your guitar between the switches by taking the lead to your multimeter and touching these screws. And I typically will touch one of those leads to this screw, and then I'll touch the plate here. You can even do this without removing anything from your Mustang, right? And then beep, that means I have continuity between those two. Then I want to check to make sure that there's continuity between that circuit and the bridge, and between the bridge and the circuit and the plate down here, and then between obviously the bridge and the vibrato, and the vibrato and the switches up here, and then the vibrato and the plate, and therefore obviously your pots and your jack down here, right? When you have both pickups set to on, okay, and that is facing in the same direction, regardless of whether it's towards the bridge or towards the neck, right? You shouldn't really be hearing any buzz if your Mustang is ground properly. Now, sometimes you might just be living, though, in a building that's got, dirty wiring, as they call it, and you will kind of hear a little bit of that buzz, regardless of whether your guitar is properly grounded. But an easy way to check is through like a small battery-powered amp. I use a Roland Cube for testing guitars that I'm working on, just to omit the possibility that I am getting any noise from the actual wiring in my building. Anyway, that is all of the stuff after many years of working on Mustangs and getting familiar again with this 1966 one recently. I hope it was helpful, especially if you just got a Mustang and are trying to figure out how to set it up right. Or if you've owned a Mustang for a while now and just have been fighting with it this whole time, and unfortunately it's taken a back shelf because it's been playing like crap. Or maybe you have one and you just never even gave the vibrato a chance because it just made your Mustang so unstable. Maybe break that thing back out, try to follow this guide and see. I hope this was helpful. And I know that there are other guides on setting up Mustangs already on YouTube, and I commend all of the wonderful guitar techs and creators that have shared their knowledge. And I hope I have added to that canon a bit with this video here. What do you think? Do you guys love the Mustang? Have you found it to be a supreme pain in the ass to set up? Did you finally have that aha moment though? What was the thing that kind of changed the game for you and made the Mustang like one of the mainstays and go-tos in your guitar collection? Definitely let me know down in the comments. As always, if you haven't already, please hit that like and subscribe button as well as the notification bell to be notified of new videos as soon as they drop. And don't forget to follow Totally Wired Guitars for more offset guitars setup tips.